Welcome. This is the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. Long term business survival is about creating maximum profit that is only accomplished when you optimize your people. And you only get to optimize people when you're in a low friction context. So twice a month, we bring you people who are out there in the real world working on this revenue culture piece, and some of them massively successful, and some of them still trying to figure it out, but we'll help you learn from all of them. Today, I am thrilled to say my guest is Susan Schramm. Susan is the founder of Go to Market Impact. That's making sure strategies don't fail because people are unclear or skeptical or not aligned in how to take action. Susan works with CEOs, boards, leadership teams to navigate risk. And we're going to talk about risk today because I don't think most of us are really good at analyzing it, talking about it, and figuring out what to do around it. Susan works with leaders of businesses, not for profits, associations, faith based organizations, and helps them to introduce initiatives, offerings, and accelerate the impact of all of those. I am thrilled to say that Susan and I have worked together. I won't tell you how many years. You'll think she started at 4, but we've worked together a long time, and it has always been a pleasure to work with her. So, Susan, welcome.
Well, thank you, Rick. This is a long time coming. We definitely have a lot to talk about today.
Yeah, it's the longest pre podcast I've ever had. So, but that just means we could do 3 of these. So, Susan, first, share a little bit about, I want to know where you are today, but I know you've had just a fascinating history. You were in some incredible industries on their race to the top of the mountain, and some of them they came down the mountain, and so share a little bit about the history and some of the things you've done.
Well, let me start with the fact that I grew up in a family that believed business wasn't just about making profits, but about serving people in your community. And that always inspired me. There were shopkeepers and small business people, and that really shaped my vision for what I wanted to accomplish in the world. And I ended up having the opportunity to work for Fortune 500 companies, starting with International Business Machines, because I wanted to work in a global business, and then Siemens and Nokia and several other Fortune 500 companies. And then worked as well with industry startups and nonprofits. I was in the focus in the tech and telecommunications industry, which, as you say, has had lots of ups and downs. My role, I had lots of different titles, but my role was always linking a big idea and a reality, making it a reality. Often that meant revenue, launching new products, new programs, new processes, mergers and acquisitions, partnerships, and even driving new industry ecosystems with all different people and players. And over time, here's what happened. I started to notice a pattern. Really good ideas would often get stuck, and very, innovative approaches would fail, not because the strategy was wrong, but because people were unclear, skeptical, and they were working at cross purposes. And that frustration, to be honest, because some of these possibilities were tremendous in terms of what they could do to improve the world, that led me to start my own consultancy and to work with CEOs, boards, and leadership teams, specifically with this idea of de-risking more proactively their strategy so that they could definitely get results better.
Yeah, and one thing as an observer that you didn't mention about your past is you are a wonderful team leader. And when you were talking about tying pieces together, having watched you work, you're often tying people together that didn't necessarily know they should be together or how to be together.
Or want to be together. I mean, and it was interesting. I think I moved into that pretty comfortably because I was, in general, I like people, And I also like diversity of people's perspectives. Just because they're different from me, I'm always fascinated. But when you try to get a large group of people with very different perspectives moving forward, as we see globally in politics or as we see in companies, that's hard. And that is why it became my fascination. And because I ended up doing research on it and interviewing people whose things had got, initiatives had gone wrong just to get to what was the core issue. And the core issue always was, were the people side of risk addressed? And that really is the focus of my work now.
Yeah, and one of the things we've talked about on this show quite frequently is that people piece. And one of the places where I think organizations create the friction or the conflict is in siloed KPIs.
Oh,
And
yeah, right. Totally agree.
I'm always amazed where people can make big budgets in their silo while the organization is failing and the peers on each side are dying and nobody's helping each other.
Right. Bec-
That
And that's the question becomes what success is. Like, what is success in that environment, right?
absolutely. Um, you know, talk to us a little bit because I really don't, I still remember to this day when I took a risk management class as part of one of my degrees. And I'd never thought of that before I took that class, and I hardly ever think of it after. But I found the class amazing. It was the head of risk management for Upjohn, which now is, I don't know who bought him, but Merck or somebody. And huge organization, and how he made that topic so um, impactful to individuals and decisions we have to make on a daily basis. What got you into the risk management piece, and share a little bit?
Well, okay, let's do a little game here. When I say the word risk, what comes to mind?
Fear, first thing that hits me.
Well, and to most people, the word risk is often implying loss, right? Of
Yeah,
some,
yeah,
and the task when you are going to have loss is to protect, right?
yeah.
Now, we all know, though, if you ever sat down with a financial planner, that they'll say, "What's your risk profile?" And what they typically are saying, "How much will you lose to gain something?"
Yep.
Right? So we all know there's an upside to risk, or we wouldn't take those risks. But what I find is, in most cases, truly, I define risk as just unknowns. Risk is simply unknowns, some of which those unknowns become positive upsides and some become downsides. But the idea of managing unknowns is something that I think it takes more communication than is often accomplished, and we don't have a good language for it. Because a lot of times in the financial world, there's a lot of risk management. In fact, de-risking is something that people view
Oh,
sometimes negatively because people will not invest in certain
right.
countries, neighborhoods, and it has some bad impact. But actually, risk management or de-risking is something that allows people to proactively and systematically think through those upsides and downsides and start putting plans in place to be ready for them. So what got me into it's funny because I realized doing research that even a great strategy will fail, and that if that happens, it's the costs are significant. It's you're not just failing. Yeah, and people think a lot about product launches, technology launches that fail because the technology didn't work or something. Yes, that is one element of the loss, but it's also you're losing time,
Oh,
you're
yeah.
losing energy, you're losing windows of opportunity, you're losing trust, and it wastes resources and it actually erodes people's momentum. So when you and confidence, so that when you want to say, okay, that didn't work, when we talk about fast fail,
Yeah.
okay, fast fail. Okay, now let's go to this next thing. Hey, we're humans, and that fail hurt. And so if we don't proactively talk about the possibilities of downside and upside, we won't really have the resilience we need. You talk about in a revenue culture, it's a purpose-driven organization that optimizes people first culture. But
Yep.
we both worked in tech for decades, right? And I laugh because I would not call many of our tech companies people first cultures, right? They were technology first and people second. Um, So what I guess that's probably where some of this motive comes from, having worked in for decades in tech, was that I realized successful strategies need to address the people side of risk, or they will fail. And the consequences aren't just the initial project. They're actually the culture and the resilience of the company over time if you don't address it.
So, I do always love our conversations because one of the things that became obvious to me only recently, we've talked about you have to optimize people in a low friction context for a while. But what I realized recently is I could optimize people in a low friction technology context, or I could do it in an engineering context or a green context. Or so in our work, I have to be clear I'm going to work on that low friction in a revenue science context for the purpose of maximizing the value you transfer. And, because it just didn't dawn on me that these, until again recently, that the context could have all of those optimizations we've talked about for years, financial or engineering or quality or whatever, and that they're all different.
It's interesting that when I started moving from working only with for-profit companies to working more and more with nonprofits, alliances, industry ecosystems, movements. What was interesting was they did not like this idea of the word customer was something they didn't want to talk about because that seemed like it was not noble enough, I guess. And this revenue focus that we often grew up with, right, was the way you had a metric for outcomes. And I realized over time that really at the end of the day, we are talking about moving people to take action.
Yep.
In one element of a business model that becomes taking action that drives an income stream, right? But in other cases, it's taking action, which means doing a process a new way, or introduce, or
Yep.
changing the way you work, or changing the way you partner with people. And so any kind of taking action together is the goal. And I laugh sometimes because of I loved your book, Revenue Science. I love the whole idea about the need for this context that says at the end of the day, what value are you bringing? But I also would say that one of my challenges is sometimes if that value is not revenue, then how else do we have to measure it?
You're, you're
And
you're on one of the hardest things as I certify people. Um, when we talk about value, getting people to realize that often, and you use, the customer word you brought up. I use buyer,
Mhm.
knowing that it creates that challenge. But when you talk about buyers, most of the time, what they really want is an emotional outcome
Yes.
that they justify some financial way. And
Mhm.
getting people to think about value, and we try to teach people how to tell preview stories to their potential buyer that the buyer can realize the monetizable value of working together. But it's not all about money. It
Yeah.
could be safety, it could be comfort, it could be
Yeah.
contribution, and you have to get out of that, accountant think and get into that people think. So I think we're working on the same thing. We got to figure out the ultimate words.
And it's one of the reasons why when I developed a process, I felt like people um, didn't have a language. They often talk about vision. And here you are talking a lot about purpose-led organizations and purpose. This is where you wanted to
Yep.
plant your flag, and I am too. But I found that a lot of the purpose conversation stayed at the very vision level. And it's one of the reasons why when I developed a system to help people talk about risk was to start with why and why now at a more outcome oriented level. What problem are we solving? Why is it important to solve now? What's the consequence or outcome we're creating? What's the consequence if we don't solve it? And these questions brought um, fuzzy conceptual ideas to a much more practical alignment opportunity. And interestingly enough, that why now clarity, which you talk about in your book a lot, allows for clarity not only about where are we going and why, but it also allows you to have options on how. Simon Sinek does talk about the fact that our brain needs the why because it helps us understand is this good for us or bad for us, and we can understand the outcome. But what I found a lot is that when you run into roadblocks, and I specialize in helping people who are stuck. So when people are stuck, they run into roadblocks. Well, what gets them out? And in that case, what's eye-opening is if you get them back to the why, to the bigger purpose, to the outcomes they're creating in the world, comfort and safety and change, and they first of all, in their own as a leader of a change initiative or driving a new product or whatever, the people who are associated with that start to get their excitement going because they can see impact. But also, it means that when things don't work well, they have options. That
Yes.
so many times, a common mistake for most leaders is focusing on what they make or the service they provide, not why. And then when that doesn't work, then they completely are flummoxed. And so it really enables a resilience because you're attracting the right people who want to solve that same problem. You're clear on what to say yes to and say no to. Does it help that problem or not? But it also unearths a lot of options that sometimes if you were too married to the how, which is
Yes.
typical in a technical world, we get in love with our product. That's a tremendous uh, opportunity for new avenues when you get stuck.
Yeah, it is really interesting how similar your research and ours are because I read a book a couple of years ago called Challenger Customer. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that
Yeah,
one.
challenger model.
Yeah, and when they talk about the Challenger Customer, they're really talking about in today's world. I think their math says there's really 6.75 buyers in every deal. Whether it's compliance, legal, you can go through a whole bunch of people who know nothing about what's being bought or sold, but they're in the deal. And as you were going through that discussion a second ago, you were going for clarity. And it's hard to get clarity because the legal person speaks legal, and the compliance person speaks regulation, and the finance person speaks money, and whoever it is trying to buy this thing speaks whatever their discipline is. And you're you are creating a language among those people for this situation. If you don't, the only common word those 6.75 people have between them is price. They all
Right.
think they know what that means. No other word that's going to be brought up will you have universal acceptance. I know what it means. So we're trying to get people, I end up talking to a lot of salespeople just because of my
Right.
background.
Mhm.
And I keep telling facilitation is the skill you have to have for the next generation. Because as you were telling that story, it's we agree on our why. There's infinite ways of how we can do this. So we need to facilitate those seven people to come together. And if the first how doesn't work, you come back and you develop the second one or the third one. So yeah,
Well, no,
I
begs
love
the question you and I talked about which earlier, which is the issue is that making sure that they take the time before they jump into all the answers of the details to get everyone clear on those bigger questions and the assumptions people are making
yep,
inside them.
yep,
And if you get that on the table, your why now, and the key assumptions you're making, and that is what you align on first before you align on the actual execution.
yep.
My gosh, you can save a lot of confusion and effort.
And that's a skill set very few individuals or organizations even attempt to master. They don't even know they need to master it.
Well, it's funny because I thought that all this would be sort of, growing up in large companies, I thought this was a large company thing. And then, and then I started working with small companies. I mean 20, 50 people, and I found out. And then I started working with startups with three people, and I'm like, Even with three people, you can be not on the same page. Like, oh my gosh. And this is not just the silos of the big corporation. It really isn't. It can be the lack of and the communication can be in people's heads. They think they've communicated something that they haven't. Or back to risk. Here's the thing is if you have different risk profiles, often the startup founder, product line driver, R&D head, or a general manager is usually the profile of risk is a risk taker. And their ability to see, they don't see risk as scary and they like to engage in it. They don't get fearful. But many of the people who are in execution have different risk profiles.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're going to just say, okay, everybody, lock and load, go. And you know what the most dangerous issue at that point is? Silence. Because silence does not mean agreement. And often it's the things in their heads running around that they see risk that you don't. And even if you wouldn't judge it as a risk, to them,
Oh,
it is.
yeah.
And I found out with all the research that brain science has been fascinating for all this. Your brain, without a plan, goes into fight or flight mode. So if you're sitting there, whether it's a plan for a trip or whether it's a plan for, how you're going to handle a meeting that you haven't planned for, your brain, until you have a scenario for how you'd work with it, starts creating anxiety. So, what do you do to help a team who you want to move forward faster? You proactively talk about scenarios and what might happen. As I call it, the what if, the anticipate what if is a key part of the Diva system because if you can ensure that the whole group has a atmosphere, a culture where you can bring up what ifs and risks and not be slapped down as a Debbie Downer,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but instead encourage to say, okay, let's talk about that. Let's pull the thread. What would happen and how would we handle it? That is a practical way to bring all those perspectives you talked about, the 6 point
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
bring them into the room and say, okay, let's just make sure, are we on the same page? Why now? What problem are we solving? What's the outcome if we don't? And then what assumptions are we making? And what if, let's just everybody think of all the what ifs that could happen that could derail this. And when you do that, you've accelerated what would otherwise not show up until a year down the road because it was an embedded assumption or an embedded
Yeah.
risk that they didn't bring up.
Well, and the way you're describing kind of a team activity there is the team can, because of the membership, the team can identify potential risks that maybe the leader or other people on the team don't even know exist.
Oh my gosh, the front line. What one of the most common mistakes I see with a lot of launches is what I call the ta-da factor, right? The boardroom developed idea that then gets ta-da'd to the whole company and out to the marketplace, and the front line is caught flat-footed. And those people, whether it's confusion, they don't know what's coming, they don't know how to look smart
Yeah.
to the people, and they lose confidence in management and it convey that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Um, and then flip side, those insights of why someone's not buying or why a customer service problem keeps happening over and over again are insights that if brought back in to an organization can vastly improve not only the speed to market, but the profitability. So yeah, you're right. That those perceptions, it's one of the reasons why when I help clients do a de-risk, we do an intensive where we'll take a strategy from beginning to end through the system. And one of the things we do is try to get every perspective around the table. And they always want to leave R&D out. It's such a funny thing. The number of times they go, well, we don't need it. We don't want to keep them, doing products. We don't need them to be in here. And we only need one salesperson, even though that one salesperson doesn't represent half the market. And so I often say, well, what would it take? I said, here's the most critical question I'm going to ask. At the end of the day, who is it that will have to take new action for this strategy to be successful? Do we have representation of that population in this work session? And it's something never often not thought through because you have all the functions
Yeah, yeah,
boardroom, but the functions are different, like legal
sure.
that's interesting. But it's the question, the real vulnerability is I have to do something new that I've
Yeah.
never done before. And those are the roles that need to be at the table.
Well, it's interesting. Back a ways when we worked primarily with the huge companies, um, people would create, and I'm talking about places like Johnson and Johnson. They create this new product that they're going to put into the market, and even if they've done good research, they don't realize that their employees in the market are already at 130 or 40% of capacity. And when you push anything new in, something's going to happen, whether it's more turnover or they ignore it or they ignore the products they were selling yesterday and nobody's even thought about it.
Well, and that is interesting enough. That's one of the issues we talk about at the beginning in terms of clarify who has to take action that's new. If that group, one of the attributes is how much capacity do they have for this? And so there's two things, right? Even if I had capacity, if I was fearful, confused, it made me, I would see it as a risk to my professional image or whatever. That's a problem. But if they have no capacity, even if they want to,
Right.
if they don't have the capacity and you're not willing to say, park this, not surprisingly, your strategy will completely fizzle. And that's one that I think that when you're trying to drive revenue, Rick, how many, I've worked in sales leadership roles too many years to so many different leaders who just, every deal is important. No, every deal can actually waste a lot of energy of someone who could be working on a different deal, right? So when that flat out do whatever it takes kind of direction happens and you put new work on them, you will not get a profitable, sustainable revenue stream in that environment. And it's so yes, it takes challenging some behaviors that we've developed over time, and some are well intended. I mean,
Oh yeah.
a high energy person who comes in and goes, "We can do this," is great. But if you look around and everybody's bleary eyed and has no life, they're probably going to be a little skeptical.
One of the things you're kind of alerting me to, we when we work with clients, we tell them after today never ever use the word demo again. And we tell them partially because the demo is about the salesperson trying to shove something down somebody's throat, and nobody likes that. But the other part of it is there's an opportunity to change the word and make it about a preview. And
Oh,
as I'm listening to you, what I'm realizing is the preview needs this risk planning component in the preview because the buyer's mind is I have this problem today and I actually can see some problems coming in the future. So as you're giving me a preview, I'd love to have us exploring my risks of action, inaction, inappropriate action, and what an interesting way to massively increase the value of the communication.
and raise your role. I mean, I'm taken away from this conversation. I love the word preview. I'm officially adopting it. And I think that it's similar to this idea of proactively de-risking, but just being willing to openly say, let's talk about the risks of that you might run into in executing this. Typically, someone when you're pushing something, you don't want to bring those up, right? So what a confidence you convey. Let's talk about the typical risks of what works well and where people run into some problems. And let's make sure you're ready to get the value of this. Oh my gosh, I would feel so immediately not pushed. I would feel like someone sitting by my side helping me effectively create a game plan. Yeah, I love that positioning.
In many cases, we're having this conversation you're talking about with the person who's going to be our champion inside the organization. And as
Yes.
we're having this initial conversation, we're filling in the blanks you were talking about earlier. Who else has got to be in this and, who's going to be the change agent ultimately. So when we create a team, we're creating the team to mitigate the risk and optimize the opportunity.
Well, it's one of the reasons I wrote my book, actually, because I was that person, and you worked with me when I was that person, the person inside the organization who's been tasked to drive an initiative, whether that's a launch or it's a change or transformation initiative. That person is often, the great news is people believe in them. They wouldn't have been
Yeah.
selected. But the challenge they have is they don't, none of the people they need to take action works for them, right? So you're sitting there, you don't have the command and control opportunity
Right.
because you're not the CEO, you're not the board. And so here you have, what are you going to do to systematically create a aligned team, internal and external, because you often have partners and suppliers who have
Yeah.
to be part of that. How do you proactively think through what you're going to need? And so one of the things I realized is, first of all, you personally needed to have a game plan so you could feel confident about how you do it. And then to invite others with you to co-create that game plan so that that's why the language becomes important. And I wrote a lot of this with the intention that it could be relevant whether you have a large company or a small company, whether you are different cultures or languages. I intentionally chose to use no acronyms because I really feel like so many times we talk past each other.
Oh, yeah.
So inviting leaders, other leaders, peers, different roles in the organization in to say these same things. Let's get on one page. What's the problem you're solving? Why are we solving it? What's the outcome we're striving for? What if we don't? Who needs to take new action? These are basic principles. What if scenarios? This becomes you're creating a culture within
Yeah.
that leadership, that team. And that culture helps you then impact other people. So yeah, I think the that wonderful person who's been tasked with the CEO goes, I got an idea. Will you go do this for us? And they're the same people who have to do, as I've done plenty of times, walked into a boardroom and say, we have a problem, right? And if you haven't done this work to clarify this with board level as with their team, clarify this, then when problems come up, you look like you failed. But if early on up front you say, and when we run into problems, this is what we're going to do. You proactively talk about risks. And that just creates a different environment for conversations, less defensive, more proactive, and you're able to be much more oriented towards helping people, acknowledging people's concerns, but also acknowledging that when you run into roadblocks, we'll be back here and we'll revisit, starting with what problem are we solving?
Well, and an overused word is everybody wants to scale. But if people don't follow a model like what you just described, you can't continually improve and build to scale. When you have a problem, then people start all over again. And
Oh, yes, that's right. And then because they don't know. And talk about alignment. You're right. If you can't get people, when they run well-intended people on the front line who run into problems, they can start solutioning, they can start coming up with different options. But if they don't have a common understanding of the problem you're solving, who you're solving it for, and your differentiation, like that you're striving for, and your business model, that's another thing that really surprised me as I started working with smaller companies, or new product launches. There was often a very unclear business model as to how this was going to sustain. And sometimes, especially in small companies, that business model is on the shoulders of the boss.
yeah,
So when people come in with ideas, they go, can't do it, can't do it, we don't have enough money. And instead of inviting everyone in to say, this is how we
yeah,
sustain, this is how we make money, this is how we go to market, this is how we support our channels, this is how we do this. And this is how it hangs together. And if something changes, how are we going to change the business model? If you can essentially educate all these stakeholders to have the same understanding of the business model or the need for a shift, then they become collaborators
yeah.
instead of creating Dr. No, the boss who says no all the time.
And when you can't always do this, but when you can engage the customer in that phase you're talking about, The customer may tell you, well, you want to build all these things, and I know it costs a lot. I only care about 60% of them now. I want the other 40 in the next 3 years, but I don't need those now.
Oh, that's so crucial. I mean, yes. And so in that early phase of definition, it's a very common issue too. And with lean and everything, we all talk about piloting, but we often will pilot to solve our definition of the problem, right? And so, and clarity about how you're going to listen with the customer for the feedback you need right from the beginning. And if they, and prioritize and all that kind of stuff. And the interaction, the one that I always found we run into in the tech initiatives I worked on was we didn't anticipate the amount of interaction with other systems and other processes. We sort of thought of our little solution on its own, like, here's your thing. Don't you love it? And they said, well, it has to work with everything else. So I like that sliver, but I've already got those answers in these other pieces. Right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was a very humbling thing. But the earlier you have that conversation, two things happen. Yes, you do prioritize. It helps you prioritize. Number two, that customer just got to co-create with you.
Oh, yeah.
And you have that wonderful, if you've probably heard of that study, the IKEA effect,
Yeah.
where if people, they've proven that if you build a table and you put a price on it after you build the table, you think it's X dollars. And that's probably 20 to 30% more than if you just walk into the store built. Because suddenly your thumbprint's on it.
Right. And
And
then what you're
loyalty
describing is you're creating partnership conversations early
early.
so that you don't have to say, well, when they sign the contract, you think they're a long term partner? Well, you should have started that 6 months ago.
And be ready for their no's. I mean,
Yeah.
a no is as important as a this is wonderful. And that saves you, if your problem that you're proposing to solve, yeah, I'm with you. And then you get to the next level, and they say that isn't even important to me. That's not, yes, that might not be a good customer. It might be that you can take the portion you have and sell it to a lot more customers. You don't have to build it all out, as you say. So being ready for a no as a welcome idea. And the same thing with employees. How many CEOs really shut down people who have questions
Oh,
about an initiative that they're trying to drive? And maybe in the first initiative discussion, they'll say, oh, yes, let me take questions. But over time, if someone keeps bringing up a concern, they say, we talked about that already.
yeah.
And, well, guess what happens? Everyone else in the room starts to go, okay, so what am I going to do? Bring up something that they don't like to hear.
Yeah.
So
So
that's hard.
we could go for another 4 hours, but I want you to talk about your book.
Okay.
You've got a book coming out on risk. So we've had some wonderful conversations today about risk, and you've taken the time, and I've seen an early version, and I can say it's just written spectacularly. I mean, I would think this is your 10th book, not your first. So tell us about it, and why did you write it, and who's it for?
So the name of the book is Fast Track Your Big Idea. Navigate risk, move people to action, and avoid your strategy going off course. My target that I wrote it for was people who are visionary leaders who have a big idea. They could be in startup mode or they could be in a large company, but they have a big idea and they're frustrated. They're frustrated it's not going fast enough. And my goal was to take some of the things I'd learned over these decades of working with initiatives that got stuck and say, what if we, in very simple terms, could help everybody avoid the common mistakes and apply these principles in a way that when they got to the point they needed it, they had something that's a practical guide. So I essentially tried to create a guide by your side for wherever you are in launching a big idea. And I had one guy who read it early on, and he said, I have an idea, but I don't know if it's big. And I said, okay, what about a small idea with big potential, right? And I mean, many times you have initiatives, and he was starting a new nonprofit. And he had, and many he also had a person who was launching a new digital strategy inside a company. And they said, well, I'm not launching a company. I said, all of these are big ideas, but the challenge is to take it from vision to execution faster. And that's really why I wrote the book. My goal, to be honest, is if I can help a whole bunch of these people, the world's really complex with some really hard problems. And if some of these wonderful purpose-led visionary people, can use their ideas and actually get results faster, the whole world gets better. So that's really my goal with this book, is to get it out to people. What I do in the book is outline the de-risk system, which has 6 principles: reconfirm why now, validate why you, clarify who has to take action, rethink how when you're stuck,
Yep.
anticipate what if, and then optimize to lead so that you can adapt to whatever comes after you. And it's filled with um, checklists and exercises you can do yourself by yourself, or you can do it with a team. And one of the things, I've often been told is, I wish I had this last time. They always go, I wish I had this with the last launch. I said, well, you can use it for the next one. It's
Uh,
okay. Because it really can accelerate 2 things. It can accelerate your ability to get people moving faster. It can also give you confidence, because
yeah,
if I really measure success for me, it will be that I have equipped and engaged and encouraged leaders for tomorrow of all ages who can solve some of these hard problems and feel confident as they move forward, even when they sometimes get stuck.
I think that that confidence piece is so important because so many people have uh, passions or um, they have a big purpose and they want to do something and they're concerned I've never done it before and
Right.
I don't know what steps to take and I don't want to ask people to help me with something that has no chance of success and so they just keep it all inside.
And then the flip side is someone who's done it and it didn't go like they thought, and they don't know why. And so they blame it on maybe the product, or what did they do? One thing that this does, it's almost like an audit of what a good strategy looks like. And so back to your approach, which says, do we have a people first model? So many times I met one client had spent millions of dollars on his own developing a software platform. And it's a really cool platform. It's a marketplace to have people work together in these nonprofit worlds. And when I got from for-profit to nonprofit, I found lots of people spending a lot of their own time, money, getting
Yeah,
volunteers involved, and he never had tested it with the actual people who would buy. See, there is a difference between the beneficiaries of
yeah,
what you're doing and the buyers, right? And you explain this very well in your book. Um, the beneficiaries might see benefit, but if there's not a business model that someone would write a check, it won't sustain. And
right.
so it's interesting to me that guy, these people who then have failures, instead of turning that into a lesson that we can move on, it becomes it's a very sad story of, I guess I'm a failure. No, you're not. You simply, here's where you are. So with this one gentleman, he comes back and he goes, okay, I found where it is. It's in clarify who, and it was in optimize to lead. And he found the section of the book, and here's what I'm doing. I'm going back. So if I can encourage people who are stuck to move forward, or people who've never started to at least get organized to take action, then it's a success. And
Well,
if you'd like to, if you there, I have a website called fasttrackyourbigadea.com, and that's where the information about the book will be. And if you're part of the early stages, I can help you get an early copy. And even there's a lot of tools. One thing about the book I think you noticed is I refer to a lot of tools that are available that you can immediately put into play.
yeah, you were much more diligent in doing yours than I was, so kudos to you. You know, one of the things I just realized as you were saying that, and then I'm going to ask you kind of a final question here in a second, but is your approach helps people, whether they've done it before or haven't done it before, set process expectations for whoever is engaged with them. Because sometimes people set these big, wonderful expectations, and then when a piece doesn't work, they desert. And you're helping them recognize things not working is part of the process, and we have a way to go from there.
That one idea of setting at the beginning, having an open conversation that says, we'll run into roadblocks. Let's talk about that, right? You're right. You've set an expectation for a culture of the people you're trying to bring along to work with you from the beginning. And they're not going to be surprised by it. And they too won't feel it's failure,
Yeah.
right? And truthfully, you're giving them confidence, right? Same way.
Yeah, and that's so critical. Well, Susan, this has been just fun and
Fun.
very educational. But what would you like to leave us with? What would you like us to say to people? Sometimes it could be new people coming into business, senior people. Just what would you like people to think about that you think is important?
So I would like a couple things to say. Number one, um, get comfortable talking about risk because not talking about risk is risky. Okay. That is my first challenge. Just get comfortable with openly talking about risk, and I'd love to help you do that. The second thing is do not confuse silence with alignment. And that absolutely is something that in a world where people might not feel comfortable talking, and we have a political world where people don't talk to each other, they don't agree. But this idea of getting comfortable listening to uncomfortable information will actually strengthen you over time. And the earlier you learn about things that might be different than your own perspective, the more armed you are and the more effective you can be at making sure it's a success.
Well, thank you. This has been wonderful. And for the audience, you can see why I was so glad to get Susan on. She has so many wonderful things to share, and it's a lot of fun. So
I'd
thank you.
love your friends to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm Susan Bailey Schramm on LinkedIn. And I look forward to having you go to my website, go to marketimpact.com, or just let's continue the conversation. You've got a fascinating community that you've developed here, Rick. And I love the fact that people are so willing to create a people first culture. And I think we can change the world if we company by company, organization by organization.
And you know, I thank you for introducing today with your family history of making a difference in the community, because
Mhm.
that's where all the power is.
It really is. At the end of the day, it's the measure of why are we here? Why do we have these businesses? Right.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Rick.
And I thank everybody for joining us. And we'll have another one in 2 weeks. And do reach out to Susan, get her book, and you'll de-risk your world by doing that. Bye.
Great. Thanks.